If you lived in ancient Rome, and let's just say you somehow survived the crowds, the heat, and the open sewers, you'll probably notice one thing before anything else: the smell. It's everywhere. And behind that smell were the people who made Rome function and suffered for it. Because for all its marble temples and grand speeches about civilization, Rome's greatness depended on jobs nobody wanted. And some of those jobs were horrible. Today, we're talking about the worst of them. A job so bad, so filthy, that even Rome's slaves joked about avoiding it. The kind of work that made people cross the street when they saw you coming. Meet the fullones and the foricarii, the Roman laundry workers and sewer cleaners. Together, they handled everything nobody else wanted to think about. Let's start with the fullones, because even their clean job was disgusting. They were responsible for washing clothes in a time before soap existed. So what did they use instead? Human urine. Yes, really. Buckets of it. The ammonia in urine helped clean fabric, or at least, that's what everyone told themselves while holding their breath. Public urinals called foricarii were placed all around the city. People peed into them, and the fullones collected the waste by the bucketful, hauling it back to their workshops. There, they poured it into large basins, dumped clothes in, and then stomped on them barefoot, like wine, but way worse. Imagine a workshop full of grown men ankle-deep in warm, frothy urine, stamping tunics for hours under the Roman sun. And that's before you even got to rinsing and bleaching. Once the clothes were clean, they were treated with clay and sulfur fumes to whiten them, because nothing says luxury like clothes that smell faintly of hell. Still, it worked. And for all the humiliation, the fullones were essential. Senators, generals, even emperors depended on them to look respectable. Rome loved appearance more than comfort. And if keeping your toga spotless meant someone else had to wade through waste all day, so be it. But if the fullones worked in filth, the foricarii lived in it. These were Rome's sewer workers, the men who maintained the Cloaca Maxima, the city's massive drainage system that carried away human waste, animal remains, and everything else that didn't belong on the streets. On paper, it was one of the marvels of the ancient world. In reality, it was a labyrinth of rot and death. The foricarii worked in the dark, crouched under stone tunnels just wide enough to crawl through, scraping muck and unclogging drains by hand. They used crude tools to push back blockages made of, well, you can probably imagine. Rats were everywhere. The air was toxic, and methane gas meant that a single torch could turn a worker into a pile of ash in seconds. Many didn't survive long enough to complain. The irony? The Romans worshipped cleanliness, public baths, perfumed oils, gleaming marble. Yet their sanitation relied on men who never got clean. The same people who laughed at the stink of sewer workers would walk on the streets those workers had just cleared. And yet, for all its horror, this job kept Rome alive. Without them, the streets would overflow, disease would spread, and the eternal city would rot from within. You could argue that the foricarii were the invisible backbone of Roman civilization, unseen, unthanked, and unmissed until everything went wrong. But as bad as these jobs were, they weren't the worst. There was one profession in Rome that made even the fullones and sewer cleaners look lucky, one that mixed danger, humiliation, and horror in equal measure. Because when it came to terrible work, Rome always found a way to outdo itself. You'd think cleaning sewers or stomping clothes in other people's urine was as bad as life in ancient Rome could get. But you'd be wrong, because if you really wanted to find the bottom of Roman society, the job that made even the city, as slaves pity you, you had to go where nobody else dared to: the arena. Forget the marble seats, the cheering crowds, and the glory of gladiators. Behind that spectacle, Rome's greatest entertainment machine ran on human misery. And someone had to clean it up. They were called arena workers, or more specifically, arena custodians, corpse handlers, and execution assistants, the invisible men of the Colosseum. They weren't fighters, and they weren't heroes. They were the ones who stepped into the sand after the show was over. When the blood dried, when the animals were dead, and when the audience had already moved on to lunch, these were the people left to deal with what remained. And there was a lot to deal with. The Roman Colosseum could hold up to 50,000 people, all shouting for blood. Gladiatorial games could last all day, sometimes even for days. Hundreds of animals were slaughtered in a single morning. Lions, leopards, tigers, bears, elephants. Then came the criminals, executed for the crowd's amusement. Crucifixions, burnings, dismemberments, and mock battles. Every day ended with a field full of bodies. Someone had to drag them out. Someone had to make the arena look perfect again by dawn. That someone was usually a slave, or a freedman so desperate for work that he'd take whatever the city offered. The pay was terrible, the stench unbearable, and the risk constant. You worked under the sun, surrounded by blood, decay, and the threat of disease. There were no gloves, no masks, no tools beyond crude hooks and baskets. At the end of every show, after the last animal was slain and the last cheer faded, these workers walked into a silence thick with death. The crowd had come for the illusion, the beauty of battle, the spectacle of courage. But for the people cleaning up, there was no illusion. The process was mechanical. They used hooks to drag human corpses to one side of the arena and animal carcasses to another. The bodies were then loaded onto carts and taken to pits outside the city, places no Roman citizen wanted to see. The workers didn't bury them with ceremony. They just dumped them. To the Romans, dead criminals weren't people anymore. They were garbage. When the human remains were gone, the workers scraped off the top layer of sand, scooping up what was left, blood, bones, hair, entrails, and replaced it with fresh sand for the next event. But even water couldn't clean the smell. It seeped into the walls, the tunnels, the air. And that's where the worst part came in, the underground. Beneath the Colosseum was a maze of tunnels and cages called the hypogeum. This was where the animals and prisoners waited before being lifted into the arena by trapdoors and pulleys. It was dark, cramped, and reeked of fear and decay. Imagine being one of the workers assigned down there, surrounded by starving lions that hadn't eaten in days, or prisoners crying in the dark, waiting for their turn to die. Your job wasn't just cleaning. It was managing the flow of life and death. You had to make sure the animals were ready, the stage mechanisms worked, and the bodies from earlier shows were cleared away fast enough not to choke the tunnels with rot. The air was heavy, hot, and full of disease. Many workers didn't last long. Infection, bites, accidents, all were common. And if something went wrong during a show, if a gate jammed or a lion broke free, the workers were often the first to die. Yet, the Romans didn't think of these people as victims or heroes. They were invisible. The arena existed to glorify death, not the ones who cleaned it. Writers like Seneca and Juvenal described the spectacle in vivid detail. The crowds, the carnage, the cheers, but almost never mentioned the people who cleaned up afterward. That silence said everything about how Rome valued them. There was one group of workers who had it even worse. The execution assistants, or carnifex's helpers. They were the ones responsible for carrying out the death sentences before the games. They prepared prisoners for execution, tied them to stakes, or dressed them in costumes for reenactments of myths that always ended the same way, with the actor actually dying. These helpers were forced to stand beside the condemned, calm and expressionless, as wild animals were released into the arena. Their job was to make sure the show went smoothly, to push a man toward a lion if he hesitated, or to clean up fast if the animal didn't kill him cleanly enough. They were trapped in a cycle where survival meant helping others die. Even gladiators, who had the slim chance to fight for glory, looked down on them. After each day's massacre, the Colosseum workers gathered what was left of the condemned, torn limbs, skulls, bones, and carted them off to the pits known as puticuli, mass graves outside the city walls. No names, no graves, no markers. Just layers of the dead, dumped on top of each other until the smell reached the streets. And yet, these same workers still showed up the next morning, ready to do it again. Not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. The empire ran on spectacle, and spectacle needed cleanup. The strange part is that Rome never hid this. Everyone knew. The upper classes joked about it. Poets mocked the stench, calling the arena workers the stink beneath civilization. They compared them to the city's sewer cleaners. But at least the sewer men dealt with waste that wasn't human. The arena cleaners dealt with waste that once was. It's easy to imagine them going home at night, tired, filthy, hands raw from pulling corpses, and walking past marble villas where senators dined under candlelight. Maybe they looked at those houses and wondered how a city that called itself the peak of civilization could depend so completely on its dirtiest hands. And yet, in their own way, they were as Roman as anyone. Rome had always been built on hierarchy, on invisible labor beneath public glory. The slaves who built the aqueducts, the miners who dug up gold, the soldiers who died nameless on foreign soil, they all fed the same machine. The arena workers were just the most visible reminder of it. Every day, they cleaned up the mess left by Rome's love of death, and every day, they made sure the illusion stayed perfect. When the gates opened the next morning and the crowd roared again, nobody thought about who had worked through the night to make it possible, because that was the point. The empire ran best when its worst jobs stayed unseen. But this wasn't just about horror or filth. It was about power. The more grotesque the work, the more it revealed what Rome really valued. And if cleaning the arena was hell, there was one more job even darker, one that dealt not with waste, not with corpses, but with the fear of death itself. Because in Rome, even punishment was an art form, and someone had to prepare the stage. If the men who cleaned the arenas handled the aftermath of death, there were others who delivered it. They were the executioners, the carnifex, and if any job in ancient Rome could be called the worst, this was it. Even by Roman standards, it was a cursed profession. Everyone feared you, everyone needed you, and no one wanted to be seen near you. The carnifex was the one who carried out Rome's darkest business. The hangings, the beheadings, the crucifixions, the brandings, the floggings. He was both a tool of justice and a reminder of everything people wanted to forget. The word carnifex itself literally meant maker of flesh, as in the man who tears it. He didn't work in public view unless ordered to. Most of the time, he worked in the shadows, at prisons, slave markets, or outside city walls. And even though his job kept Roman law running, he was treated like filth. He wasn't allowed to live inside the city, couldn't enter temples, and wasn't welcome in taverns or markets. To touch him was to touch death itself. But when the time came for punishment, everyone called for him. Executions were entertainment as much as justice in Rome. Criminals, rebels, and slaves were tortured or killed in front of crowds. Some were beaten until their bones cracked. Some were burned alive. Others were nailed to crosses along the highways, a warning to anyone thinking of rebellion. And behind all that, unseen by the shouting masses, stood the carnifex, quietly doing his job. Some executions were even worse. Rome had a taste for creativity and cruelty. Thieves were thrown to wild beasts, deserters buried alive, traitors strangled inside sacks with snakes, dogs, or monkeys, called the foricarii. Guess who prepared the sacks, tied the ropes, and delivered the condemned to their deaths? The carnifex and his assistants. It wasn't just physical torment, either. The executioner had to make sure everything looked official. The law demanded precision. Before each act, he read out the charges, announced the name of the condemned, and carried out the sentence in front of magistrates. Everything about it was meant to show order, not mercy. And the worst part? Many of these men didn't even choose the job. They were slaves, criminals, or debtors forced into it. It was punishment disguised as work. If you were a criminal spared execution, you might be given a choice: die, or become the one who kills. Most picked life, at least for a while. But it wasn't much of one. No matter how long you worked, you could never escape the stigma. Even your family carried it. Children of executioners grew up shunned, sometimes forced to take the same role because no one else would employ them. The job passed down like a curse. They weren't considered citizens, even if born free. They couldn't marry into respectable families, couldn't hold property, couldn't even testify in court. The empire used them and erased them. And yet, without them, Rome's justice system would collapse. The courts could sentence all they wanted, but someone had to swing the blade. Someone had to keep fear alive. Because fear was how Rome ruled. Public punishment was never just about the condemned. It was about the crowd. Watching someone whipped or burned wasn't meant to satisfy revenge. It was meant to teach obedience. It told every citizen, every slave, every soldier, this is what happens when you cross Rome. And for that message to work, the executioner had to do his job flawlessly every single time. But what did that do to a person? The ancient writers barely talked about it, maybe because they didn't want to. Historians mentioned the carnifex in passing, usually as a symbol of disgust. Cicero called them the shame of humanity. Seneca wrote that executioners lived closer to beasts than men. Even slaves pitied them. But none of those men ever had to stand in front of a screaming victim and finish what the law demanded. There is something haunting about that silence, about how completely Rome depended on them, yet pretended they didn't exist. You can find their traces only in fragments: tools unearthed near prisons, iron chains, shackles, and curved knives designed not for hunting, but for cutting flesh. No monuments, no graves, no names. Just the evidence of someone doing the ugliest job in history. And here's the part Rome would never admit. The carnifex wasn't an outsider. He was the empire's reflection. Every time he raised the whip or the hammer, he showed what power really looked like. Not noble, not divine, but cruel, efficient, and necessary. Even emperors depended on him. When Nero or Caligula ordered executions by the hundreds, it wasn't their hands that did the killing. It was men like these. They were invisible extensions of the emperor's will, the flesh and blood machinery of punishment. The Romans liked to talk about justice, law, and order, but those words meant nothing without someone willing to make them real. For the carnifex, there was no glory, no applause, just the sound of chains, the weight of silence, and the knowledge that everyone hated him but everyone needed him. And yet there was still one job worse. Because if the executioner dealt with those who defied Rome, another group dealt with those Rome simply used up. The forgotten, the expendable, the people whose lives ended not in defiance, but in neglect. Their job wasn't to kill, it was to erase. By the end of the day in ancient Rome, the city looked peaceful, torches flickering, voices fading, marble walls glowing in the dusk. But behind that calm was something darker. Because while citizens slept in their villas and taverns, someone else was still working. The people whose job began only after everyone else went home. They were called libetinarii, vespillones, and pollinctors, Rome's undertakers, corpse collectors, and body washers. And if the executioner carried out death, these were the ones who lived with it. Their work began where everyone else's ended, in the aftermath. When a Roman died, whether from sickness, accident, or execution, it was these men who handled the body. They collected corpses from homes, streets, prisons, and even battlefields. They worked through the night, often with nothing but torchlight and the smell of rot to guide them. The libetinarii ran the grim business of death. Their name came from Libetina, the goddess of funerals, whose temple in Rome served as the city's morgue and supply shop. You needed a coffin? They sold it. Funeral masks, oils, incense, burial shrouds, all came from them. Death was their trade. And though Rome claimed to despise them, it couldn't function without them. Then there were the fullones, the corpse carriers. These were the ones who walked the streets after dark, searching for the dead who had no family, no tomb, and no coin for a burial. They picked up bodies from alleys, rivers, and sewers, loaded them onto carts, and took them beyond the city walls. They didn't ask names. They didn't perform rites. They just cleared the dead. Imagine it. The heat of summer, the air thick with decay, pushing a cart piled with corpses through narrow streets while dogs barked and people closed their shutters. The pay was small. The risk was high. Touching the dead made you ritually impure, and infection was common. But someone had to do it, because if they didn't, Rome would drown in its own dead. The pollinctors, meanwhile, prepared bodies for the funerals of the wealthy. You'd think that was better, but it wasn't much. They cleaned the corpses, dressed them in fine clothes, and rubbed oils over skin that had already begun to decay. Their hands were constantly stained with the smell of death. They worked quietly in the homes of the rich, then disappeared before guests arrived for the procession. The family would praise the beauty of the ceremony, the flowers, the musicians, the speeches, while pretending the men who made it possible never existed. These workers were forbidden from temples, theaters, and baths. No one wanted to share space with the smell of death. Children threw stones at them, merchants refused to sell to them, and priests avoided even saying their names. They lived near the edges of the city, on the Esquiline Hill, the place Romans used as a dumping ground for garbage and unburied corpses. It was the closest thing to a slum in the ancient world. And that hill tells you everything about how Rome treated its dead. The poor, the enslaved, the criminals, anyone without family or wealth ended up there. Bodies were tossed into open pits, layer upon layer, until the ground itself turned black with decay. The smell could reach the city walls. And every day, the corpse collectors came back to add more. Archaeologists later found those pits, hundreds of skeletons tangled together. Bones of men, women, and children mixed with animal remains and broken pottery. No graves, no markers, just the forgotten. And somewhere among them were the remains of the people who had once carried the rest there. It's hard to imagine what that kind of life did to someone. You woke up knowing you'd spend the day surrounded by the dead, that the living hated you, that even the gods wouldn't listen to your prayers. You did it anyway, because there was no other choice. Yet, in their own way, these workers kept Rome alive. Without them, disease would have swept through the city. The emperors, senators, and philosophers, all of them depended on the invisible army of men who handled the filth, the death, the things civilization pretended not to see. Rome called itself the height of order and cleanliness, but that order came at a cost. It was paid by the hands of those who cleaned what no one else would touch. And maybe that's the most Roman thing of all. The empire that conquered the world was built not just on soldiers and senators, but on sewage men, arena cleaners, executioners, and corpse collectors. People who worked in the shadows, carrying the weight of Rome's greatness on their backs. They never got monuments. No marble statues, no honor, not even a name in the records. But without them, the streets would have flooded, the amphitheaters would have stunk with rot, and the empire's perfection would have collapsed in days. So when we think about the worst job in ancient Rome, it is not just about filth or death. It's about how a civilization that called itself eternal relied on people it refused to see. The men who cleaned its sewers, washed its blood, and carried its corpses built Rome as surely as any emperor.